Well, I joined Red Cross when I was a very small boy. I joined Red Cross when I was in Raffles Institution, my first few days of Raffles Institution. I was very impressed by the recruitment talk that was given by my seniors, and so I signed up. But when I signed up, I did not join the Singapore Red Cross Society. There was no Singapore Red Cross Society at the time. I joined the Singapore branch of the British Red Cross Society, and that was what my enrollment certificate said, that I was enrolled as a junior member of the Singapore branch of the British Red Cross Society. The Singapore Red Cross Society was established only very much later, but I've been a Red Cross member for a very long time. There was a period of time when there was a gap because I had other things to do. Basically, I was pursuing a career. But I was invited back, first to be a board member of the Home for the Disabled. I was there for a few years. And when General Winston Chu became chairman, he suggested that I should stand for election and be a member of the council. That's how I came back to Red Cross. And I was a council member for many years, basically overseeing the International Services Division. And later on, when the vice chairman stepped down, I was then appointed as vice chairman in his place. And I continued to be vice chairman for many years after that. Many people now recall that at one time there was a blood collection center in Red Cross here, right here in Red Cross House. Well, blood has always been a core competence of the Red Cross. It's related to our core competency, which is disaster relief and also our role in armed conflict. So many Red Cross societies are involved in the management of the blood supply of a country. So there's a lot of expertise on blood collection and blood management throughout the Red Cross world. So sometime, I believe in the 70s, Singapore Red Cross was given, you can say, a sort of subcontract to collect blood for the Singapore Blood Transfusion Service. And a blood center was opened in Red Cross House. There were doctors, there were nurses, there was equipment. Red Cross House is a very small place, and therefore the cost of running the center is very high because you still need the doctors, you still need the nurses, you still need the equipment, even though your operations are quite small relative to the operations of the blood transfusion service. Our council at the time then decided that given all the liabilities of operating a blood bank, it's best that Red Cross not be involved in the actual collection of blood, but rather just focus on recruitment of donors and management of donors. So from that time onwards, we were the agency that recruited and managed donors, but the actual collection was done by HSA. So it's HSA that now does the collection, with the Red Cross being responsible for the recruitment and management of donors. To understand the establishment of the International Services section of the Red Cross, we need to understand the circumstances at that time and a little bit about the history of Singapore Red Cross. And we were, before that, part of the British Red Cross Society. In fact, when I joined, I did not join Singapore Red Cross. I joined the Singapore branch of the British Red Cross Society. Being part of the British Red Cross Society, we always had it in our mind that disaster relief is one of our core competencies. And for Singapore, this is very natural because in Singapore, even though we don't have national emergencies, at least not many, we have many regional disaster emergencies. Why? Because we're part of or rather we're just next to the ring of fire, where there are a lot of volcanoes, a lot of earthquakes, and a lot of tsunamis, and not to mention, we're in Southeast Asia, so we have a lot of floods. So it's natural that Singapore, being right in the center of Southeast Asia, would be, in the eyes of the International Red Cross movement, a center for disaster relief. That was recognized when the International Federation of Red Cross Society, the IFRC, at that time it was known as the League of Red Cross Societies, decided to establish their regional disaster relief warehouse in Singapore, right here in the ground floor of Red Cross House. And that was with us for a very long time until they decided to move it to a location closer to where the emergencies are. That was the background. Singapore Red Cross always had an interest in disaster relief and in international affairs because of location, because of our history, and of course because of the fact that we are probably at that time the most connected of all the Southeast Asian nations. Even before the establishment of Singapore Red Cross International Services Division, Singapore Red Cross was already involved in rendering relief outside Singapore. And one of the major initiatives that we undertook before the establishment of IS, International Services, was actually in North Korea. Not many people recall this now, but there was a famine in North Korea in the 1990s, a very bad famine, and Singapore Red Cross was one of the many international agencies that provided relief to the people of North Korea. We supplied rice, which we bought from China, and this was trucked over from China into North Korea. That was one of the major operations mounted by Singapore Red Cross at that time. International services in Singapore Red Cross began with General Winston Chu, chairman of Singapore Red Cross. At that time, he was just appointed chairman of Singapore Red Cross. Coming from the SAF, he's used to military-style operations, used to thinking outside, just wherever your little surroundings are. So he had a view of the world, and he thought that Singapore Red Cross can really make a difference in providing relief to the people of our region. So he brought in Colonel Lim Tiam Poh. Colonel Lim Tiam Poh was a former SAF officer who had just retired, and he had a lot of experience in organizational work. Colonel Lim got to work very quickly, and he started, first and foremost, developing contacts with all the relevant agencies, especially the IFRC, the Regional Red Cross Society, most tellingly with other agencies in Singapore who can collaborate in rendering disaster relief to the people of this region. And foremost among these agencies, of course, is our Singapore Armed Forces. So with General Chu as chairman and Colonel Lim as manager of international services, Singapore Red Cross began a very close relationship with the Singapore Armed Forces and also with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because General Chu was also a diplomat. After he retired, he was High Commissioner to Australia, so he knows the people in MFA. And with the collaboration of these two, Singapore Red Cross had the capacity, given our own resources, to mount fairly large international affairs programs, including disaster relief. But in terms of profile, still not that many people knew about Singapore Red Cross in terms of disaster relief. The event that changed everything was the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami, where hundreds of thousands of people died. It was a disaster of biblical proportions. Singapore Red Cross was one of the first agencies to respond. And of course, our first response always was to send an inspection team, which we did. And we collaborated especially with PME, the Indonesian Red Cross Society. We also collaborated with the Sri Lankan Red Cross. And again, something which not many people remember, we also had operations as far as the Maldives. So together with other agencies in Singapore, it was a multi-agency team which included Singapore Red Cross, Mercy Relief, a lot of other charitable organizations, and most importantly, the SAF. We were able to make a difference to quite a number of the victims of the Boxing Day tsunami. In particular, in two places. One was in Mulabo in Aceh, and the other was in Sri Lanka. Operations in Sri Lanka actually are very interesting because Sri Lanka at that time was a war zone, and yet our volunteers and our staff were able to operate rather effectively, I must say, in all these areas. Now, collaborating with other agencies in a major exercise to render disaster relief outside Singapore has got huge beneficial effects for Singapore Red Cross. I understand that the total amount of money that we collected for the Boxing Day tsunami, and this came from all sources, particularly from the people of Singapore, amounted to $89 million. Now that's a huge amount of money, and it was unprecedented for any collection in Singapore for relief of disaster victims. What Red Cross did was that we have decided very early that we will not keep all the money for our own projects. The money came from the people of Singapore, and the people of Singapore should be able to spend it in a way that they would like in order to benefit the disaster victims. So what we did was we offered to share the funding that we have to fund projects which other groups in Singapore, other agencies who would like to provide relief to the disaster victims would like to carry out. But of course, we're very careful that there's a need to make sure that the monies are well spent. We put in place a system of governance and training for those whom we're going to fund. And we also carefully monitor how the money was spent to make sure that none of the money was wasted. And I'm happy to say that from our close monitoring, we're able to say that truly this money was applied for the benefit of the victims of the tsunami and not for private purposes. Now, apart from region, we're also involved in disaster relief further afield. One area where we were involved in disaster relief was in the Indian subcontinent, in Gujarat, for example, and in BAM. Gujarat is in India, BAM was in Iran. Now, in all these cases, we send teams to provide disaster relief, but more than that, we tried to help in the rehabilitation effort by helping the reconstruction, by funding the reconstruction. In Sri Lanka, we rebuilt homes for some of the victims of the 2004 tsunami. And in Gujarat, we built many health centers which were destroyed during the earthquake there, but they were rebuilt by international agencies, quite a few of which were rebuilt by Singapore Red Cross. In fact, the Indian government was so appreciative of this that we received an award from the President of India. I went to Delhi to receive the award on behalf of Singapore Red Cross from the President of India. That was a very proud moment for all of us. I think we are one of the few agencies that are recognized by the government of India for the good work that we did over there. Apart from disaster relief, International Services of the Singapore Red Cross has a lot of other functions, all related to international affairs. Under the Geneva Conventions, the responsibility for making international humanitarian law, i.e. the law of armed conflict, known worldwide, falls on states, and they are assisted in this regard by national Red Cross societies. So when International Services was established, we established a very active program of trying to get IHL better known among our people here. Very on, we decided that the best way was actually to get to the young people, get the young people interested in IHL, and then hopefully when they grow up, they will spread the word about IHL, make sure that this is better known in society, and of course, hopefully they also will be future leaders of Singapore Red Cross and will carry the Red Cross values and the Red Cross message with them. So what we did fairly early after IS was established was first and foremost to get our university law students to be involved in the Jean Pictet International Humanitarian Law Moot Competition. We funded some of the first teams to attend this competition, and I must say that our teams have done very well. Several of teams have actually won this competition, which is held in Europe, against other teams from all over the world. And this year, our team had just returned. They made it all the way to the finals, but they lost the finals. So they were the run-ups, but good enough. It shows that Singapore is actually a force in the IHL world, certainly among the law students. The other thing that we did was to get JC students interested in IHL by organizing a series of debates on IHL topics. We had judges, local judges, as well as judges from the regional office of the ICRC as judges. And we offered a prize. The winning team gets a chance to visit the Red Cross headquarters in Geneva, fully paid. That was a prize they offered. I understand it's no longer the case now, But for many years, this is one of the most sought after debates. And because the team have to prepare for these debates, they read up on international humanitarian law and get to know that particular aspect of international relations. So it was a very good thing. In addition to that, in addition to the Jean Pictet moods and the school debates, the JC debates on IHL, we were approached by the Hong Kong Red Cross Society to participate in their Red Cross regional IHL mooting competition. A mooting competition is a law competition. It's a competition among law students whereby they debate over an IHL problem and try to determine who is guilty or who is not guilty. It's a very good training exercise because in order to be able to debate properly, they must read up, they must get to know the subject. So it's a very good way of getting students to know IHL. Well, the first team which we sent was, I think, in 2003. That was the very first team that we sent. And I had the privilege of leading the team as the legal expert for the team. And the first time we took part, we won the competition. Surprised everybody. And since that time, Singapore has consistently won that competition. There are many things which I imprinted into my memory. For example, during the time when there was famine in Indonesia, I was in the team that went out to distribute food to places like Solo, Central Java, that area. We traveled by van through very, very rough roads, and we stayed overnight in hotels which would hardly qualify as hotels. They're more like guest houses. But we felt we were doing something good. And I would dare say that at the end of the day, we all enjoyed ourselves. Of course, the tsunami was an experience for me. Not so much the collection of money, but the response of the people of Singapore. There was so much empathy that came out from the people of Singapore that it made me proud to be a Singaporean, to see how people respond when there's a time of need. Of course, there's also the legal part. I mean, I represented Singapore Red Cross in quite a number of international conferences, particularly in international humanitarian law, where I interacted with a lot of experts from all over the world. That was not just an occasion for me to make sure that Singapore is represented, but it was also a learning experience because I interacted with some of the top experts in the world on international humanitarian law, some of which are now judges in the International Court of Justice. So these are the people who made my life very rich. But really, the persons who made my Red Cross life very rich are the members and staff of Singapore Red Cross. They're a wonderful bunch of people whom I work with. I remember people like Jerry Lau and Christopher Chua, the SGs at that time, and now of course, Ben. They're wonderful people to work with because they've got a heart. When you do Red Cross work, you must have the heart. If you don't have the heart, you will firstly do a lousy job, but mostly you won't enjoy it. Well, in terms of the timeline of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, 70 years will probably be around middle age, because the Red Cross movement started with the Red Cross Convention, which was, I believe, in 1864. So 70 years is about middle age. I think one of the challenges of any person or organization who have reached middle age and who have reached a certain level of maturity and achievement is to rest on your laurels, to think that you've done a lot and that really your record can speak for itself going into the future. That is a dangerous thought. I think that those of us involved in the Red Cross must continue to strive in order to make sure that the objectives of the Red Cross are manifested and carried out through all of us. That means first and foremost, knowing what the objectives are. Secondly, being committed to those objectives. And thirdly, doing our very best to make sure that we achieve those objectives. The next 70 years will be very challenging for all of us given increasing globalization, increasing challenges to the Red Cross itself, because in a way, Red Cross now has got many competitors. But Red Cross has something which a lot of other organizations do not have, and that is the experience of an international network of states and societies, and of course experts that provide a corpus of expertise and value systems that I think many others would envy and find it very difficult to match. So with this, we are well positioned to go forward in our Red Cross journey into perhaps the next 100 years.